Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Sophia Giovannitti reads an excerpt from her book Working Girl, which examines the textualities between sex work and the art world, and the ways in which they commodify desire.
In 2010, about to turn 18, I went alone to MoMA to see The Artist is Present, the retrospective of Marina Abramović's work. I stepped between two naked people on either side of a relatively narrow doorway, which felt more silly than provocative. The nudity was devoid of eroticism, unlike Abramović's on-site performance. Abramović sat in a chair in the museum's atrium, which she occupied 7 hours a day for the duration of the show, over 700 hours, while museum-goers waited in line for their turn to sit across from her. I did not sit across from her. I did not want to wait in line. Decades before this retrospective, in 1975, Abramović performed a piece called Role Exchange in Amsterdam. Having worked as an artist for 10 years, she decided to find a prostitute in the red light district who had worked as such for the equivalent duration, and to swap places with her on the night of her gallery opening. The prostitute attended the party at the gallery in Abramović's place, while Abramović sat in the prostitute's window in the brothel district for 3 hours. Abramović described this piece in a 2009 interview. She told me that she saw this as a business and that her body was completely divided emotionally from it. It was quite incredible to see how she could separate the emotional and the physical. At the opening itself, they asked the prostitute, "Do you like art? What do you know about art?" She said she didn't know anything about art, but she knew, quote, all about fucking. I put on a show in 2021 at a gallery in New York where I turned the space into an in-call, a place where sex workers host clients. There was a bed and a kind of sitting room and self-portraits on the walls, and I offered visitors different kinds of available appointments to speak with me or otherwise solicit interactions. In the gallery, people asked me all kinds of invasive questions. Poor at setting boundaries, I usually answered. A heterosexual couple came. The woman was interested both in hiring a sex worker and in becoming a sex worker, though she assured her boyfriend, sitting across from me on the couch, that she, quote, never actually would. Her boyfriend asked if I had kids. What he meant to say was, how would you explain your work to your kids? I answered sincerely and only afterward registered the indignity of his question. I guess I would tell them, Mommy's an artist, I offered, signifying my belief that identifying as an artist gives one license to do as they please without fear of judgment or condemnation. The man who asked me this was an addict in recovery, so he also asked why I had harm reduction materials for safer drug use out in the gallery, like fentanyl test strips and naloxone. I explained that I think all art spaces should have such materials on display and available to the public for free, as drugs line the fabric of the art world and overdose occurs with greater frequency, it seems, every day. Also, I told him sex workers often do drugs with their clients, or at the very least are often in the company of clients doing drugs. I don't think this happens with any greater frequency than it does in the general population. People tend to hire sex workers on their leisure time, and since many people take drugs recreationally, it's not uncommon to want to deepen one's reverie once a step toward the illicit has already been taken. Taking pains to avoid overdose is particularly important in the context of transactional sex. Criminal activity is already taking place, ratcheting up potential charges, and the sex worker tends to fall in the position of blame, whether for possession, distribution, or accidental manslaughter. The sex worker, too, is at greater risk of overdose without life-saving intervention, as a client likely won't want to call for help should the person they've hired experience a medical emergency while using an illegal substance. Such an event might ruin their reputation or career or marriage. In her position in the red light district, Abramović was not patronized by any clients. 2 potential clients came by. One, she explained, wanted to see the woman he was used to seeing and left upon learning she was absent, while the other was really drunk and wanted to know the price, and it was too high for him. I could not lower the price. That was basically the only rule I had to respect, so he left. Of the impact performing her piece had on her perception of prostitution, she says, "I see it now as from their point of view, as a real job, a job of selling the body without emotional attachment. But what happens in the process is that human emotions get fucked up. A lot of problems come up in the end with this work, like drug use, which is much the same thing that happens with artists. Many artists these days die from an overdose because of the intensity of being an artist, and the demand of society on them is so high. Both prostitutes and artists often come to the same end." Abramović appears fixated on the idea of using the body without emotional attachment, that the body and mind might be cleanly severed. I can attest to this. It's not so much that what happens is not felt in the moment, but that almost immediately following, it slides off the body like water from feathers. I once spoke of this phenomenon to a curator who asked if I enjoyed sex in the context of work. Because I was attracted to him and enjoyed speaking with him, the question didn't bother me as much as it might have, and I said enjoyment was irrelevant. In a work context, one self effaces. He suggested such disappearance from the self was an effort to disconnect, to escape the event, and I said, sure, of course, but certainly not more so than one escapes the self in any other workplace. Some people need drugs to do this. Some might prefer drugs to do this, but work sober just as often. A glass of wine or a well-timed martini has often been integral to making the time pass easily for me, though I'm careful with my level of intoxication when spending time with someone paying for access to my body. I have friends who take Oxy or Xanax or Adderall or Ambien or methamphetamine before working at a hotel with a client or before working at a studio on a piece of art or writing. Nan Goldin's extraordinary slideshow, The Ballad of Sexual Dependency, first exhibited in the early 1980s and published as a book in 1986, documents herself, her friends, and her loved ones, many of whom were drug users, sex workers, artists, and drag queens, throughout the 1970s and 80s. Goldin became addicted to OxyContin in 2014 after doctors prescribed the drug for a surgery recovery. "It was the cleanest drug I'd ever met," she writes. "When I ran out of money for Oxy, I copped dope. I ended up snorting fentanyl and I overdosed." Of the prostitutes that came into the Times Square bar she worked at for half a decade in the 1980s, the period in which she was taking photos for Ballad, Goldin says, prostitutes drank Long Island iced tea. They wanted to get as drunk as possible on one drink. I believe it. The poet Rachel Rabbit White writes of her years as a sex worker, "Never thought of a dick in my mouth as anything but an interval, my pussy as nothing but a vortex, and if I've suffered, I surely never felt it." Going elsewhere is part and parcel of sex work. Attempting to abandon one's mind while a particularly unpleasant sensation is taking place in one's body happens often. An aggressive tongue in an ear, a tender caress of hair, repulsive in its attempt at true intimacy, a condom drying out after entering and exiting too many times, ripping at the seams of the body. Dissociation simultaneously flags and glosses over violation, two states that are part and parcel of capitalism. Several summers ago, I worked in an office. I worked for a publishing company, a glorified assistant in all aspects ranging from PR efforts to mailing packages. It was easy. For a so-called 9-to-5 job, the actual hours were merciful, 10 to 6, the office flexible and frequently all but empty. Nevertheless, I hated it. I did not like having to be at the same place every day, having at least 35 hours of my week taken from me for tedious tasks I had no feeling for. Once, sitting through a staff meeting, I thought I might scream. The skin-crawling feeling was the same as in bad moments of sex work, as though if I didn't exit the situation, I might choke or die or bite someone. The intolerance becomes physical. I flex my calf muscles, grind my teeth. I finally excused myself from the meeting, rushed to the park outside, and burst into tears, calling my boyfriend. "I can't do this," I said. "I can't do this work." This is to say, it's work that is intolerable, the oppressive fact of wage labor that drives us to dissociate, to exit our bodies or else inhabit them in the worst of ways, like a smoke-blind person attempting to crawl their way out of a fire, desperately trying to evade the source of the damning heat. Of course, I can do wage labor, and I have, and I do. I have held many jobs, many are fine. But fine is not how life should be. I firmly believe that no one should have to work to live, that the imperative to sell one's labor in exchange for the fulfillment of basic survival needs is a foundational violation. Of retiring from sex work, Charlotte Shane writes, "I want this chapter of my life to be over. But if this chapter is understood to be earning income through any labor, as opposed to specifically earning income through sex, I will have to wait many years for it to end." Some portions of this chapter have been more offensive than others. I worked as a hostess at a popular brunch restaurant for the better part of a year. I spent mornings explaining to entitled parents that their family of 4 would have to wait 2 hours to sit. Enraged, their spittle reaching across my hostess stand, they would gesticulate wildly toward the empty tables in front of us. No matter how many times I explained that a system was in place, that other waiting families had been texted from my iPad and were on their way back to claim these tables within 8 minutes, the parents grew redder in the face, speaking to me as though I were both stupid and vindictive. During the same period, a client spat on me and a colleague, getting his spittle on my chest and in my hair, and slapped us. You can imagine in which case my hourly rate was higher. You can imagine in which case I felt more violated. There is a human appetite for violation, which many artists have made the subject of their work. In Rhythm Zero, performed in 1974, Abramović stood for 6 hours alongside a table upon which sat myriad objects and the following written instructions. There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance, I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility. Duration, 6 hours, 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. One of the objects was a loaded gun. She says, "I felt really violated. They cut up my clothes, stuck rose thorns in my stomach. One person aimed the gun at my head, and another took it away. It created an aggressive atmosphere." Yoko Ono, too, invited a violation of sorts in Cut Piece, 1964, wherein she invited audience members to cut off pieces of her clothing with scissors and keep the piece they cut. In 2016, Abel Azcona performed La Guerra, presenting himself sedated with narcotics to an audience whom he allowed to use his body without constraint. I have made art about violation too, and what has helped me understand is less the unique impacts of any particular violation on the body, but the pervasiveness of violation itself through all spheres of labor and social life under capitalism. My body often feels strained after I work, having been contorted in an unnatural or uncomfortable way. But my body feels strained too after sitting at a desk, after writing or scheduling tweets for a company, or picking up a crying child who refuses to walk a step further, as I did for years babysitting. The body at work is necessarily traumatized, destroyed. This is more true in some jobs than others. I do not find it to be particularly true in highly paid prostitution. I understand the impulse to submit to the whims of others, the curiosity at how far a person might go. But there is a difference between someone taking something from you and a priori giving that thing away by virtue of absconding a limit. I do not wish anything to be taken from me. I wish to give freely or to sell.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.